let's bring in a friend and warrior for centre-right values around the world. He is the editor of the outstanding Spectator magazine, the London version, the original and the best. His name is Fraser Nelson, and he joins me out in the studio. I don't often have guests, so it's lovely to have you here. Hey, tomorrow night, you're on a speaking tour. Tomorrow night, you're giving a speech to the Robert Menzies Institute. I declare I'm on the board of the Institute, so we're delighted to have you in Australia. You've got sort of 5 main themes you're touching on. The first is demographic change, and I thought that the experience of Europe on this issue is just really powerful.
Yeah, demographic change differs around the world, but in Europe, the speed of it in the last 20 years has taken everybody by surprise. After the Cold War, people thought, let's abolish borders, the EU has got freedom of travel, and nobody really moved around until it really picked up just after the turn of the millennium. Now you've got a situation where something like a third of Sweden are either immigrants or children of immigrants. So you end up with sort of 2 cultures in one society. But that can be a problem if you don't adapt the rules. Now, Sweden have got, for example, it's impossible to commit a criminal offence if you're less than 15 years old in Sweden. So you now end up with criminal gangs giving machine guns to 13, 14-year-olds, and they're running around committing huge crimes. So Sweden isn't changing its rules because they think, why should we? This is our society. So that is one example. In France, you've got big Muslim integration problems. In Italy, you've got the small boats, the migration issues, which you used to have in Australia, but now you don't. In Britain, I think we're a pretty good melting pot, actually. I think Britain, America and Australia are the great melting pots because we believe in sort of one cohesive culture. We don't really go in for multiculturalism. It's the multicultural aspect that can cause the tension. And Conservatives, I think, have struggled to get a narrative about this because you want to be a country where everybody is welcome, people blend in, people get along. But you do that by insisting on what binds us together rather than allowing divisive forces to tear apart.
And when we've previously argued for integration, we've allowed the left to frame that as assimilation, leave your culture behind, you have no culture once you come to our country. And of course, that's not what we're saying, but you've got to join the team, isn't it?
Exactly. If you're going to come to a country, you need to work out its norms and values and contribute towards it. And you can't really come there and be at war with that country. This is basic. I mean, most successful immigrant countries around the world, Australia is one of them, get that right. But the problem is that Conservatives can sometimes come across as being anti-immigrant or xenophobic or be accused of racism if they don't make the argument properly. Or if
they don't come the right way. I mean, a lot of these are economic migrants. They're not refugees in the UN definition sense, and that's also a challenge, isn't it?
It's a huge challenge, and this undermines support for immigration and asylum in general. So if people think the system is being unfair, you need to defend it. So in Britain, what we're trying to do is come up with an Australian system saying, let's deport illegal arrivals to Rwanda, because that will break the people traffickers. They're the enemy here, it's not the refugees. Now, that is hugely controversial, but I reckon it's the only solution longer term, because we're only going to get more people coming via people traffickers. And if you don't get on top of the situation, you're going to get a public backlash, and you're going to get xenophobia, and you're going to go down the road which Britain so far hasn't gone.
Net zero. I mean, I have to say, sadly, a centre-right government here under Scott Morrison drank the Kool-Aid and signed away our energy security for 30 years or 20 years down the track. It seems there's been a bit of a rethink in Europe coming out of the Ukraine energy crisis. Please tell me that's so.
Well, I think net zero peaked about 4 or 5 years ago as an agenda in Europe. You're now seeing big public backlashes against it, protests in the Netherlands, and politicians are beginning to work out that this bill, which they were slow to calculate, is now approaching. So if you're going to say you're going to ban, for example, all petrol cars by 2030, that's just a few years away, and people are thinking, hang on, I can't afford one of these EVs. So what Rishi Sunak is doing in Britain is just rowing it back just a bit, saying, hang on, let's do a cost-benefit analysis of this. Now, he's broken the omerta of net zero, that you never mention the costs, you never mention the trade-offs, you just talk in this hyperbolic language about the world's ending and we've got to act. When you actually subject it to rational analysis, will this make a difference to the overall picture? Do we want to tax the poor out of the sky and off the road? Can we make this more palatable? Then that changes the conversation. Now, Rishi Sunak and Claire Coutinho, his new energy minister, she talks about net zero zealots, people who are pushing it so far that they jeopardise the whole agenda because the public are not going to go along. No. So if you're a serious environmentalist, you want something that people are going to buy into. There's no point pushing an agenda that governments are going to be forced to jettison. So we're seeing a distance now between the sort of net zero zealots and the more realistic ones. And in Australia, I think you guys are a little bit behind the curve here, I hope you don't mind me saying.
I hope we catch up though.
Yeah, but we can see the sort of modification of this. So we're seeing a kind of moderate centre ground emerging. People, of course, they care about the environment. They want to recycle, they want to reduce their carbon footprint, but they don't want to force people to spend in Britain £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 for a heat pump. But it is a common sense way of doing it. And this is now beginning to be introduced into an argument that had been quite kind of extremist and hyperbolic so far.
Okay, so that sort of thinking between the elites and the people that are impacted on the ground is where we were on Saturday night on this whole question of a voice in Australia. And one of the other touch points you've got is this rise of identity politics around the world.
Yes, now I think Australia is the first country in the world to have a referendum about identity politics. I don't think it was quite intended that way, but because the voice, there wasn't a specific notion, the only thing you had to debate was the principle. Do we believe we should be divided by race in the Constitution? And also, I think something amazing here happened. You had a leader emerge from almost nowhere, Jacinta Price, who had this vocabulary, this way of describing it, saying we're fighting for our values, this is about what unites us, say no to the voice of division. So all of a sudden, the Conservatives get what they're not used to having, which is a sort of a hero, a champion, somebody who can explain the basics, the ethics, the moral case for conservatism, the moral case for cohesion, and attacking as divisive the identity politics, which focuses, asks people to regard themselves as tribes and to have more in part. I mean, the thing is that, as Kemi Badenoch, our culture secretary, says in Britain, that she's from Nigeria, where there is tribalism as a problem there, and if you ask people to focus on what makes you similar to somebody thousands of miles away who looks like you, rather than your next door neighbour, it never ends well. Tribalism never ends well. And I think tribalism is being rejected in Australia. And in doing so, you found a cohesive narrative which has assembled a huge coalition of voters in Labour states, in liberal states. We're now seeing a new electoral map, just like after Brexit. But Britain blew the chance after Brexit to make a political agenda out of this watershed. It'll be interesting to see if Australia now takes this chance.
Of course, your PM resigned when he lost Brexit. Ours, unfortunately, is digging in even harder. I've got to leave it here, and we didn't even get to freedom, lockdowns, and, of course, the issue of trans rights. But we'll get to that tomorrow night. Thanks, Fraser.
Thank you.